amount should you put on the edge of your gusset? It does, logic suggests that it's an inch, because you have an inch of seam allowance here between sleeve and armhole, and you have an inch of seam allowance here. For this particular project, I'm going to tell you to do a 1/2 inch, because the fabric is so bulky.
Get it out of the way.
And I wouldn't be surprised if one of you started doing all of this, and Brenda and I looked at it and went, oh, we got to go down to a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch all through here, because there's just so much fabric there.
Could you do an inch and then just trim it off, just to be safe?
You could indeed. Because, and Kristen actually makes a good point, the more seam allowance you've got in this instance, I mean, you don't want like 4 inches.
Yeah.
But the difference between having an inch of seam allowance and a 1/2 inch of seam allowance will make it easier to stitch in, and then it can be trimmed away later. And you will see, Brenda and I do that on a relatively regular basis, where we leave all the seam allowance on, get it stitched in, then trim it and overlock it afterwards.
Sounds like pants.
So that's a perfectly viable way to go.
The other thing I would mention is, since you're back stitching here, 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 and here, and possibly repeatedly taking it out, just remember your back stitching is 2 to 3 stitches maybe?
And not 84.
Yeah.
Just
and-
a real quick.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not, because once you keep taking that out, you're gonna start getting holes in your.
Yeah, especially because this fabric has a slightly larger weave. That's a really good point. Yeah, because, I mean, keep in mind, think about hand sewing. 90% of the time, we just tell you to put a knot in there, right? It's not like we tell you to go over top of itself and then start sewing. So the tendency to go either back like 6 stitches and forward 6 stitches is really overkill. And then the overkill of forward, back, forward, back, forward, back, sometimes people will do. It's really, in a lot of ways, it's actually more detrimental than it is useful.
Do we practice it at all, like in muslin?
I think that you don't need to practice it in muslin. If you want to, you're welcome to, but because it's straight lines and hard corners, you all know how to stitch those. The problem that you're going to have really is not with the first line of sewing, it's with the second line of sewing. And so what I mean by that is, you go to do this line of sewing, and then you have to do this one that comes over to it. You have a single layer of fabric on the gusset side, and you have a double layer of fabric on the sleeve side. So it wants to start to push it all in this direction. And so it's really about the pinning and the stitching of the layers, especially in this thick fabric, more than it is the actual stitching itself.
And should we have you check our pinning before we sew?
You know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because one thing I was just going to mention is a lot of instances when I'm doing this kind of thing, I pin slightly differently. So I want you to tell me if these 2 examples make sense. And I know that they're going to make sense to you because you've had to do this a lot. Angle pinning. If you think about 2 pieces of muslin that you're pinning together, they're relatively 2-dimensional, right? Once you start to get into fabric that's thicker, it starts to become more 3-dimensional, right? So if I have 2 layers of fabric and I take my pin, thank you, I pin down like this and then I dig across like that, what did I just do to the top layer of fabric?
Pulled it back.
I just shoved it in that direction, right? So what I like to do is what I call angle pinning. I take one pin and I go straight down like this, and sometimes I actually do it directly into the table. And then I take a second pin and do this with it, stabbing line to line, line to line.
Making sure that this pin does not.
Making sure this remains completely vertical, that it doesn't start to slide around. And then I know that these 2 points haven't shifted in relationship to one another. And so what that means for me is, when I go to stitch this kind of thing, what ends up happening is, I actually do a total of 3 pins at every notch. Pin 1 is this one right here. Step 2 is my parallel pin that's on my pencil line, that's on a severe angle. Then I pull this guy out and I put a 3rd pin in right here. So I actually have cross pins at that point. And both of those second 2 pins have been done at an angle so that presumably these 2 haven't shifted. When I go to stitch, the other thing I then do is I get over top of the sewing machine like this. And I put my fabric underneath and I turn that wheel until I can see that that needle is piercing exactly where I want it to go. I don't use the foot pedal at all to move back and forth to begin with. In fact, if I'm really concerned about specificity, I'll do this, I'll take 3 steps, and then I'll do what's called an industrial back stitch. So what does that mean? I've stitched, if you look at most industrial sewing machines, they don't have a reverse on them, but you still need to have a way to be able to back stitch, right? So what an industrial back stitch is you take that first stitch that I talked about, 1, 2, you turn the wheel so the needle comes up, you lift the presser foot, move your fabric back into the original orientation, and do that again. I really like to do that because then I can see that all of those stitches are stabbing in exactly the right spot.
So you hand turn the wheel to sew instead
are
of pushing
correct.
the. Oh, okay.
Don't you get like a line of thread then if you go fast?
You do get a small line of thread, but again, if you're only doing 2 stitches, you've only got 2 stitches worth. If you go 6 stitches worth, then you've got this long piece. In the long run, even if you've only got 2 stitches, you're still going back and getting on top of it again, and so the 2 are locking each other in place.
And the good thing about that is, you know, if you go forward, you can make sure you've got that point. But backwards, it's so hard to see that if you're going backwards, you might not hit, especially with all the thicknesses, that exact same point.
Well, that's what I was going to say, because the other thing is, you've got this. You've got a single layer here and a multiple layer here. It doesn't want to back reverse up on top of it because it's getting caught on all of that layer. So doing all of this by hand is not a terrible, terrible choice. And so I will do that at both corners. I'll start with it that way, and then I'll use my foot pedal to get from there to there, and then I'll stop, and I'll finish the whole thing by turning the wheel as well. It makes it feel like it's taking a longer time, but it's actually not.
Once is left
Compared
faster.
to, yeah.
Once is
ripping it out.
faster than 4 times.
Cool.
Who's scared of this step?
I'm scared of all of it.
I wouldn't be surprised by the way that Brenda and I are talking about it if you were scared. You've all got the skills to do it. The thing that you should be scared about is making sure that you have the time to do it.
Right.
Because it is going to take you, it's a 2-inch square. That should take you like 5 minutes to sew in, right? Because it's square, it's straight lines. It's going to take a while. You know, it's going to take a little bit of time, so you've got to make sure you plan accordingly.
But other than that, it's not scary like you're slashing,
Yeah, it's
you
true.
know, into your
Yeah, I
fabric,
haven't
just,
done that yet.
just sewing. That
Yeah.
can be taken out, done again.
So when we get to that corner part, do we pivot or do we do individual?
You have to do individual. And so that's
I've
what,
tried for centuries to pivot.
and you can't. So you have to stitch this,
Back
this,
stitch. Yeah.
and then each of the 4 sides
okay.
individually.
With a back stitch on each side.
Correct.
Lord Jesus.
Should I run and grab some?
If you wouldn't mind, that would be great. Don't you have to leave?
Yeah.
So there